So the focus of our service today is resistance, liberation, and hope. And I'm now going to share the first part of 3 parts of this service. First will be shared by me. We'll have some music. Then we'll be shared by Debbie, by Rebbe Debbie. Then we'll have another piece of music, and we'll have a closing reflection shared by Reverend Pippa. So, good morning again. Happy Easter, happy Passover. I'm delighted, as always, to be with you on Sunday mornings, especially this Sunday. For Easter was always, in our tradition, the most sacred, most focused holiday in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which I was raised in. And it still is my favorite holiday. I've happened to, for many years, I would host Easter in my home, which I put aside for a few years because I host Easter with you now. But it was always very sacred, very extraordinary. The Armenian Church is very ornate on Easter Sunday. There is a pulling back of a curtain that is hung across our altar all during Lent, and the altar is re-revealed. There are flowers. There is exceptional music, and we would come home to a beautiful meal, a family from all around, and always coloring Easter eggs was and still part of our family tradition. At the center of it, for part of our family, was, at least growing up, was the miracle of the death and resurrection of Jesus. But for my family, there was something more to Easter than just that. It wasn't just about the miracle. Our focus was more, and remains, focused on Jesus and his teachings, the loving being that we understand and understood him as, whether he was human, divine, or both. In looking at the resurrection through the life of Jesus, it invites us to consider something more profound. Easter is an invitation to see resurrection not simply as something that happened 2,000 years ago, possibly, but as a metaphor for what continues whenever love rises again in the face of cruelty, whenever truth stands up against oppression, and whenever hope refuses to die. Easter was an invitation to look for, in my family, for what's good and for what's right. And yet I stand here thinking this thought over and over, especially as I've been preparing for this service, is that there's something curious about how Christianity has evolved. It seemed more focused on the miracles of Jesus' birth and death than the teachings that filled his life. The teachings about loving your neighbor, forgiving your enemies, caring for the poor, standing with the oppressed. Those teachings receive far less attention, but they are the essence of movements of resistance, liberation, and hope that continue to echo across humanity for centuries. In that sense, I think perhaps Christianity is missing a holiday. Not another day celebrating miracles, but a day devoted to remembering the teachings. Imagine a holiday that's not centered on supernatural events, but on the radical ethical vision that Jesus shared over and over. A day dedicated to the Sermon on the Mount, to celebrating the courage to love our enemies. A day reminding us that whatever we do to the least of these, we do to one another. What if this day was a day when the focus shifted from belief to practice, to how we live our lives? From what we were asked to believe about Jesus to how we're invited to live because of him. In recent years, voices like James Tallarico have been reminding people of exactly this. Tallarico is currently running for senator of Texas, and he was a former seminarian and a teacher. And he speaks out often about the difference between the teachings of Jesus and the way Christianity, let's say Christian nationalism more so, is being used in politics and culture. He points out that when we look carefully at the words of Jesus, we find a clear moral vision of compassion over cruelty, humility over power, and love over fear. I see a lot of heads nodding in this room. I'm sure there's some on Zoom as well. In other words, the teachings themselves are remarkably clear. Feed the hungry, care for the poor, welcome the stranger, forgive one another, stand with those on the margins. They are not vague spiritual sentiments. They're concrete ethical directives. They are calls to action. And when we view them through the lens of our theme today, resistance, liberation, and hope, they come alive in powerful ways. The teachings of Jesus were in their time acts of resistance. They resisted systems that placed power over compassion. They challenged religious authorities who valued rules more than mercy. They disrupted the idea that some lives mattered more than others. They were teachings of liberation again and again. Sounds familiar. Again and again, Jesus proclaimed freedom for those bound by shame, exclusion, poverty, or fear. His ministry moved towards those society pushed away. Those are the people we advocate for here in Unitarian Universalist congregations. They were teachings of hope. They were teachings of an invitation to turn around the way you see life, to see things with new eyes. And with hope, not grounded in magical thinking, but in the belief that human hearts can change, that justice can grow where injustice once ruled, and that love, when practiced courageously, can reshape our world. Perhaps that is the resurrection story we need today. Not simply the story of a body leaving a tomb, but the story of teachings that refuse to stay buried. Teachings that rise again whenever someone chooses compassion instead of indifference. Teachings that rise again whenever communities gather, as we do here, to imagine a more loving and just country and world. So maybe the holiday we need is devoted to living the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who never once said to worship him. He only said, "Follow me." A day when we can recommit ourselves to the work of resistance against cruelty, liberations from systems that diminish human dignity, and hope that love still has the power to transform lives. But surely, if anything in the world can, it is love. And perhaps if we live those teachings fully enough, we will discover that resurrection is not only something to celebrate once a year, but something we can help bring into the world every single day. Thank you, everyone, and happy Easter.
Good morning, Pippa. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you, Reverend Sonia. Even this good Jew would celebrate that holiday, celebrating Jesus' teachings. Happy Easter, happy Passover, which began on Wednesday and continues for 7 days, so we're right in the middle of it. You know, it's very interesting listening to Rev Sonia's talk. You will hear a lot of overlap between Easter and Passover. I'm going to read a short story called Not by Bread Alone. In the spring of 1945, a father and his teenage son shared the harsh labor in the Nazi camp. The father suggested a pact between them to save part of what little bread they received. Well, after several days, the father reported to his son sheepishly, "I'm sorry, but I have given away our whole store of bread to a new arrival. "Why?" asked the son in desperation. The father explained, "There are two reasons. First, he needed food even more than we. And second, I exchanged the bread for a miniature Haggadah. Several days later, using this Haggadah, the father was able to raise people's spirits by conducting a Seder for many inmates. Even though matzah was unavailable, the Seder gave everyone a special kind of nourishment, hope." And I'll talk a little bit more about the Haggadah and the Seder in a minute. Hope. The desire and belief that a positive ending is attainable gives people the will to live and the will to fight and the will to fight oppression, even during the worst of times. In the spring of 1943, in the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising happened on the first day of the first night of Passover. A small group of very poorly equipped Jewish people waited in their apartments for the 2,000 German soldiers to enter the ghetto square. And at that point, they threw in whatever weapons they had, guns, Molotov cocktails that they had made. They even had 2 homemade bombs and were able to strike at two army tanks. And they saw the Germans run. This was the first time that during the Holocaust that the Jewish people saw the Nazis flee. Well, they fought for days, which turned into weeks, even though they knew what the final outcome would be. There was no way that they could survive. So they fought because they had the hope that their actions would mean something and would make a difference. And in fact, they did. They lost their lives, but they did not surrender. They resisted. The themes of resistance, liberation, and hope are central to Jewish history and religion. That's why Passover, with its emphasis on the degradation of slavery and the blessings of freedom, has been the most widely celebrated holiday by the Jewish people for centuries. Despite its serious message, it's also a joyous celebration with lots of preparation, food, and singing. Well, we can say that all Jewish holidays, including Passover, fit the same pattern. They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. When I was growing up, we didn't talk about the meaning of these holidays. What I knew about the holidays was on Rosh Hashanah, apples and honey. On Yom Kippur, no food. On Hanukkah, latkes, which are potato pancakes. And on Passover, matzah and macaroons. But when we would go to my aunt's house for a Passover Seder, and she would pass out the chicken soup, we saw the numbers tattooed on her arm. Nobody ever said anything. We had no idea that there was a relationship between that number, which we had gotten in Auschwitz, and the meaning of Passover. Hitler's goal was to obliterate the Jewish people, our history, and our culture. But my aunt resisted. How? When she got to the United States, she got married and had 3 children, a doctor, a pharmacist, and a famous Hollywood lawyer. And each of those 3 kids had children. Her resistance, survival, and generational survival. My father's family also. There's 6 children in my family. We all have children, and our children have grandchildren, have children. Many ways to resist. Passover is not just about matzah and macaroons. It's a very rich holiday in symbolism and meaning. The Haggadah, and I'm going to show you an example if you don't know. The traditional Haggadah is this one that you might have seen at ShopRite. The language is from the Bible. It's extremely boring. Very few people use this anymore.
That's true.
But as many congregations as there are, that's how many Haggadahs there are. This is one that I picked up that focuses on children, and it makes the language easy, and it has illustrations, and it's much more relatable. We even have a UUCP Haggadah that my family still uses every Passover. The Haggadah, which we read at the Seder, the ritual meal, has a carefully constructed order. Its symbols and rituals remind us of the bitterness of slavery as we eat bitter herbs and dip greens into salt water to remember the tears of the slaves. The rituals remind us, too, of the great joy of liberation as we sit comfortably in our seats and eat sweets and drink sweet wine. The Exodus story, which is told during the Seder, has inspired generations under oppressive regimes to believe in the possibility of freedom, and not just the Jewish people. The uniqueness of this liturgy, of the celebration, is that it tells us we should think of Jewish history also as a timeless present. Passover is not simply a commemoration of an important event in the past, but an event in which we participated and in which we continue to participate, as if we ourselves had taken part in those events. It's a difficult concept when we read it in the Seder, in the Haggadah. But every year we re-experience the slavery and liberation that occurred in the Exodus story. At the Seder, we try to empathize with that original liberation and discover its relevance throughout the generations. For example, wine is an important part of the Seder ceremony. But at one point, we are asked to diminish our glasses of wine for each of the 10 ancient plagues. We do that by dipping our finger in the wine and putting a drop on our plates. The Egyptians suffered during those plagues, and the literature says we should not be happy at the suffering of others, even if they are our enemies. I went to temple this week for a second Seder, and it's a Reformed temple, and the first minister I had said the closest religion to Unitarian Universalism is Reformed Judaism. So I'd like to read something from that Haggadah. This reminds me of a play I just did where she says, if I can only find it. Okay, so in the Haggadah, they are talking about the 10 ancient plagues, things like frogs and boils, etc. Our rabbis taught, God is urgent about justice, for upon justice the world depends. Each drop of wine we pour is hope and prayer that people will cast out the plagues that threaten everyone everywhere they are found, beginning in our own hearts. The making of war, the teaching of hate and violence, despoliation of the earth, perversion of justice and of government, fomenting of vice and crime, neglect of human needs, oppression of nations and peoples, corruption of culture, subjugation of science, learning, and human discourse, the erosion of freedoms. This Haggadah was published in 1975. Does this sound familiar to anybody?
Very.
How far we have come. The holiday speaks to both physical and spiritual liberation. Though we may be physically free, we are all enslaved to something, and some people to many things. Maybe money, power, alcohol, people, work, self-doubt, self-hatred. You get the idea. The Hebrew word for Egypt means narrow straits, a place of constriction and bondage, contrasting with the wide open space of freedom. Every person frequently finds him or herself in agonizing straits, sometimes for physical, psychological, emotional, or spiritual reasons. To prepare for the holiday, we're supposed to clean our houses and remove all non-Passover food. Spiritually, it's an invitation to cleanse our souls of everything that inhibits our own freedom. People are meant to be free. Freedom is sacred. It will not be there for everyone unless we resist the will of those in power who are fighting for their own survival. We can change the future by how we live in the present. The Passover Seder ends with us saying, "Next year in Jerusalem." It's a metaphorical Jerusalem. Let us be free and at peace. Let the world be free and at peace. Judaism says that we matter, and what we do and don't do matters. We must find our own unique role in the work to be done. Passover celebrates our freedom and challenges us to ask ourselves, what should we do with the freedom that we have to liberate others? Let us be inspired by the resilience and courage of the Israelites, and let us work together to create a world that is more just and equitable for all people. Belief in our ability to make a difference is the most hopeful of all things. Okay.
We wanted to leave you with two questions. And in this story of Exodus and liberation from slavery, these two questions I've titled, what are we walking from and what are we walking to? So what are we walking from? The Exodus, of course, is not just an isolated episode from ancient history. The sages teach, as Deborah reminded us, in every generation, and indeed, ideally, every day, we are obligated to see ourselves as if we personally had left Egypt. And Egypt is not just a geographical location or an historic event, but also a state of mind and a central focus point for self-awareness. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim is made up of the same Hebrew letters as the Hebrew word Meitzarim, which means limitations, or very often is translated as narrowness. Symbolizing, of course, the areas in our lives where we may feel stuck or constricted. So in a personal sense, the Exodus from Egypt implies an internal process of liberation, moving us beyond our emotional, psychological, and even physical limitations, which sometimes, of course, as we all know, are self-imposed. So the first step out of each internal bondage is the recognition and the acknowledgement that our circumstances and our capabilities are not fixed. And that's an important thing for us all to remember, especially on a day like today, that our circumstances are not fixed and that a different reality is always possible. The Exodus from Mitzrayim is a metaphor, therefore, for our personal and spiritual growth, urging us to recognize and overcome the places inside us that are narrowed, and entering into a deeper understanding of our own journeys from oppression to freedom, both within ourselves, but also, as Reverend Sonia said, in the broader context of human rights and justice. So we're asked ourselves, we're charged today and this time of Passover, where have we narrowed ourselves? Where are we shrinking? Where are we feeling overwhelmed or stuck? And in that asking, to acknowledge, of course, that sometimes we desire an easy answer, any answer, in fact, but a reminder that the call, of course, is to stay open to the questions and to the unfolding of those questions. And now walking to. Where are we walking to? Well, in this Easter weekend, I'm always captivated by the deeper meaning of the Easter Saturday, which of course was yesterday. And Easter Saturday holds, I believe, a profound teaching for us all. In the Easter holiday, of course, it's considered the quiet day, the day of reflection, the day between the breaking and the blooming. It's a day that asks very little of us except honesty. Because Easter Sunday is not triumphant like it is today, and it's not certain. It's a day of waiting, of not knowing, of sitting with the weight of what has been lost. And as Deborah said, what has been lost is, even since 1975, still very real to us today. So in the Christian story, of course, this is the day when the disciples are scattered, afraid, grieving. All the promises that they'd been asked to trust in felt shattered. The future that Jesus had inspired them to imagine had suddenly, unexpectedly, gone dark. And for us as Unitarian Universalists, Easter Saturday, I believe, speaks to all of those moments in our lives when we find ourselves in between endings and beginnings, between heartbreak and healing, between the life we knew and the life we cannot yet see. Now, of course, especially in the 21st century, we live in a world that urges us to rush past or rush around or rush through these moments. And we're being constantly told we have to fix it, to resolve it, to move on. But what I like about Easter Saturday is that this day reminds us that there is wisdom in the pause, and there is truth in the not yet. Because something is happening here, even if it's invisible. Beneath the surface of grief, something is stirring. And in the silence, something is gathering strength. So this Easter weekend, especially Easter Saturday, invites us to trust the transformation that does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it begins in the dark, in the soil, in the tomb, quietly, patiently. And so this day asks us, can we stay present to the uncertainty in our own lives, in the lives of those we love, in the life of our nation, of our world? Can we sit gently and compassionately with what is unfinished, unresolved, unknown? And can we honor the sacredness of what I like to call becoming, even when we cannot yet see what we're becoming into or we're becoming as? So this is not a passive waiting. It's actually a very courageous kind of waiting. I love what the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls it, and that is holding our seat. It's a waiting that holds grief with great tenderness, and a waiting, most importantly, that keeps a small flame of hope alive, even when the night feels long. Not new life itself that we can see, but at least the willingness to remain open to it. So wherever you find yourself today, wherever we find ourselves today, whether it's in loss, in doubt, in transition, may you know this space in between, almost this gap between the two trapeze. It's not empty. It's actually full of possibility. It's full of unseen movement. It's actually full of life, preparing itself to rise. And when the time comes, as it always does, may we be ready to meet it.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.